There wasn't a place set for me at my own son's dinner table. I noticed it the moment I walked into Daniel's dining room that Sunday evening. 4 plates. 4 wine glasses. 4 folded navy blue linen napkins arranged carefully beneath polished silverware. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island with a glass of white wine in her hand, smiling at something her friend Melissa had just said, while soft jazz drifted through the house from hidden ceiling speakers. The scent of rosemary chicken and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air, warm and inviting, but somehow none of it felt meant for me. Daniel glanced up when he saw me standing in the doorway with my coat still on. His expression shifted too quickly for me to read clearly. Surprise, maybe. Or guilt. "Mom," he said softly, already looking away again. Vanessa turned then, placing one manicured hand dramatically against her chest. "Oh goodness," she said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "I thought you weren't coming." The room fell strangely quiet for half a second. Just long enough for me to understand what had happened. There really wasn't a place for me. Vanessa crossed the room gracefully in her cream-colored sweater dress, and kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. "Traffic must have been awful," she continued smoothly. "We almost started without you." Almost. I stood there holding the blueberry pie I'd baked that afternoon in my tiny kitchen 40 minutes across town, suddenly aware of how old my winter coat looked compared to everything inside that house. The marble countertops. The glowing pendant lights. The expensive candles burning near the staircase. Even the air smelled expensive somehow. "I brought dessert," I said quietly. Vanessa's smile tightened just slightly. "That's sweet," she replied. "But Melissa already brought macarons from that little French bakery downtown." She took the pie from my hands anyway, and set it on the counter beside unopened mail and a vase of white tulips. Like it was an afterthought. Like I was. Daniel finally walked over and kissed my forehead quickly. "You made it," he said. Not, "I'm glad you're here." Not, "We were waiting for you." Just, "You made it." I looked again at the table. 4 settings. Vanessa followed my eyes immediately. She was fast like that. "Oh, let me grab another chair," she said casually, already turning toward the hallway closet. "I didn't realize you'd stay for dinner." The words landed softly. That was what made them hurt. Melissa suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck without saying a word. And I stood there smiling politely while something inside me turned cold and still. "I can leave if it's a bad time," I offered, though I hated myself a little for saying it. Vanessa waved her hand immediately. "Don't be silly, Margaret. We'll make room." Make room. As though I were an unexpected neighbor who had stopped by unannounced instead of Daniel's mother. Instead of the woman who had spent 18 years packing his school lunches before sunrise and working double shifts after his father got sick. Vanessa disappeared briefly into the laundry room and returned carrying a folding chair. A folding chair. She placed it at the far corner of the table near the kitchen entrance where everyone's backs naturally turned away from me when they spoke. "There we go," she said brightly. "Cozy, right?" Daniel stared down at his phone. Melissa gave me a sympathetic smile that somehow felt worse than cruelty. I sat down slowly, smoothing my navy cardigan beneath me while the others resumed their conversation, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Vanessa immediately launched into a story about a couple they'd met at a Napa Valley resort the previous month. Daniel laughed politely at the appropriate moments. Melissa asked questions. Wine glasses clinked softly under the dining room chandelier. And through all of it, nobody looked directly at me for more than a second at a time. It was strange how invisible a person could become while still sitting in plain sight. I picked at my food quietly while Vanessa spoke across me several times, reaching for dishes without acknowledging my presence. At one point she asked Melissa if she thought the dining room would look better after they knocked down the wall near the staircase. "Once we renovate everything," she said. Casually, sipping her wine, "this house is finally going to feel like ours." Hours. Daniel nodded without lifting his eyes. I felt my fingers tighten around my fork. Because until that moment, I hadn't fully understood what Vanessa had been doing all these years. It wasn't sudden cruelty. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Slower. She had been erasing me one quiet dinner at a time. I barely tasted the food that night. The rosemary chicken was tender, the mashed potatoes creamy with too much butter the way Daniel used to love as a boy, but every bite sat heavy in my mouth. Vanessa kept the conversation moving effortlessly, gliding from one topic to another with that polished confidence people admired about her. Vacation plans. Property values. A new fitness studio opening downtown. Melissa laughed often, tilting her head back dramatically while Daniel smiled into his wine glass like a man watching someone else live his life for him. I sat quietly in the folding chair at the edge of the table and listened to the sound of silverware against expensive ceramic plates. The strange thing was that nobody was openly cruel. That would have been easier somehow. Vanessa never raised her voice. She never insulted me directly. She simply behaved as though I existed slightly outside the evening, like an old photograph someone forgot to remove from the wall. At one point, Daniel stood to refill everyone's wine glasses. He filled Melissa's first, then Vanessa's, then his own. He sat back down before realizing my glass was empty. "Oh," he said quickly, reaching again for the bottle. "Sorry, Mom." Vanessa smiled softly beside him. "Margaret barely drinks anyway." I looked down at the pale gold liquid finally pouring into my glass and remembered another dining room 20 years earlier. A smaller house. A scratched oak table Daniel's father had bought secondhand from a retired couple in Ohio. Back then Daniel used to race downstairs before dinner because he wanted to sit beside me. "Save my seat," he would shout from the hallway while pulling off his baseball cleats. Even as a teenager, taller than me by 16, he still kissed my cheek every evening before sitting down. After his father died, those dinners became sacred to us. Just the two of us eating quietly under the yellow kitchen light, while rain tapped against the windows of our little house outside Cleveland. Sometimes we barely spoke because grief sat too heavily between us. But he always looked at me. He always saw me. Vanessa laughed suddenly at something Melissa whispered, pulling me back into the present. "Honestly," she said, cutting into her chicken, "I think people hold on to old traditions because they are afraid of becoming irrelevant." Her eyes flicked toward me so quickly another person might have missed it entirely. But I did not miss it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Vanessa," he murmured under his breath. She touched his wrist lightly. "What?" "I am talking about society in general." Melissa stared at her plate. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap and kept my expression calm even while something painful tightened beneath my ribs. The chandelier above us cast warm amber light across the table, softening everyone's features except mine reflected faintly in the dark dining room window beside me. I looked tired. Smaller somehow. Like someone fading at the edges. Vanessa stood halfway through dinner to bring out a salad I had not noticed earlier. As she moved around the table, she paused briefly behind Daniel's chair and rested her hand against his shoulder possessively. "We have been thinking about hosting Thanksgiving here this year," she said brightly. "A fresh start. New traditions." Daniel nodded automatically. "That could be nice." I waited for one of them to mention the Thanksgiving dinners I had hosted for 23 straight years. The turkey I woke up at 5 in the morning to prepare. The handmade centerpieces. The pumpkin pies cooling beside the kitchen window while Daniel watched football in the living room with his father. But no one mentioned any of it. Vanessa continued speaking smoothly about guest lists and renovation ideas, while I sat there listening to my own memories being quietly replaced in real time. Then came the moment I could not stop thinking about afterward. Melissa asked where Daniel had gotten the antique silver serving tray sitting near the candles. Before he could answer, Vanessa smiled casually and said, "It belonged to Daniel's family, but we are slowly updating things around here. Daniel's family. Not my family. Not our family. Daniel looked at me then for half a second, and I saw it clearly for the first time. He knew. Maybe not fully. Maybe not enough to stop it. But he knew I was disappearing from his life inch by inch, and he had decided silence was easier than choosing sides. I excused myself shortly after dessert. Vanessa did not ask me to stay longer. Daniel walked me to the front door while Melissa remained in the dining room pretending not to listen. The night air outside felt sharp and cold against my face. Daniel opened the door for me quietly. "Drive safe, Mom," he said. I waited for something more. An apology perhaps. A hesitation. Anything. But he only stood there with one hand resting against the doorframe, while warm light spilled behind him from the house. I nodded slowly and stepped onto the porch. As I walked toward my car, I noticed through the front window that Vanessa had already started clearing away the extra folding chair. The drive home felt longer than usual that night. Rain had started falling sometime after I left Daniel's neighborhood, soft and steady against the windshield, turning the streetlights into blurred golden smudges across the glass. I drove slowly through the quiet Ohio suburbs with both hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying every moment of dinner in my head. Not because of what Vanessa said. It was what she did not say that stayed with me. The empty seat. The folding chair. The way she spoke about the future as though I belonged entirely to the past. By the time I reached my little townhouse, the rain had soaked through the hem of my coat. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me carefully, listening to the familiar silence settle around me. My house always smelled faintly like cinnamon, and old books no matter the season. Daniel used to tease me about that when he was younger. "Mom," he would laugh, dropping his backpack near the stairs, "your house smells like a library baked a pie." I stood in the kitchen for a long moment without turning on the lights. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the living room curtains before disappearing again into the night. Everything in that house still carried traces of a life that no longer existed. My husband Richard's reading glasses sat untouched beside his favorite chair even though he had been gone for almost 6 years. The grandfather clock near the hallway still chimed 10 minutes too early because Richard always insisted he would fix it himself. I never corrected it after he died. Somehow the wrong time comforted me. I slipped off my shoes and placed my purse gently on the counter. Then I noticed the blinking light on my answering machine. Hardly anyone used those anymore. I pressed the button absent-mindedly while filling a kettle with water. "Hey Mom, it is me," Daniel's voice said softly through the speaker. "Just wanted to make sure you got home okay. Call me tomorrow." That was all. No mention of dinner. No acknowledgement of how uncomfortable the evening had been. Just another careful step around the truth. I leaned against the counter while the kettle slowly heated, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think something I had been avoiding. Daniel was afraid of disappointing Vanessa. The realization settled into me quietly, like snow collecting overnight. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just undeniable. I carried my tea into the living room and lowered myself carefully into Richard's old recliner. Across from me sat dozens of framed family photographs arranged along the mantel. Vacations. Graduations. Christmas mornings. There was one photo from Daniel's law school graduation that had always been my favorite. He stood between Richard and me wearing his dark blue cap and gown, his arm wrapped proudly around my shoulders. Could not have done it without her, he had told everyone that day. Vanessa had not entered our lives yet back then. Everything changed slowly after she did. That was the frightening part. There was never one single moment I could point to and say, that is when I started disappearing. It happened in pieces. Smaller birthday dinners. Fewer phone calls. Holidays shortened because Vanessa's family had other plans. Photographs posted online where I somehow never appeared because I had supposedly arrived late or left early. Tiny exclusions stacked carefully on top of one another until eventually nobody noticed the pile anymore except me. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. Gray winter light filtered through the kitchen blinds while coffee brewed quietly beside me. I wrapped myself in my old cream-colored robe and opened my laptop at the dining room table. I do not know exactly what made me search Vanessa's social media page that morning. Maybe loneliness sharpens instincts. Maybe some part of me already knew there was more I had not been seeing. Her newest post had gone up sometime after midnight. A photograph from dinner. Melissa smiling brightly beside Vanessa while candlelight glowed across the table. Daniel sat between them holding a wine glass. The caption read, "Perfect evening with the people who matter most." I stared at the screen for a very long time. Then my eyes drifted slowly toward the background of the photo. My folding chair had already been removed from the table. For the next several days, I could not stop noticing things I had ignored before. Once your eyes adjust to darkness, you begin seeing shapes everywhere. That photograph stayed in my mind while I moved through my quiet routines. I watered the small fern near the kitchen sink. I folded laundry while old radio music played softly in the background. I stood in line at the grocery store beside tired mothers and elderly couples discussing soup recipes and discount coupons. Life continued exactly as it always had, but something inside me had shifted permanently. By Thursday afternoon, snow flurries drifted lazily across the sidewalks outside my townhouse. I was sorting through old mail when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, sweetheart," I said gently. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded distracted, muffled slightly like he was multitasking. I could hear office noise behind him. Printers. Phones. Low conversations. "How have you been?" I looked down at the stack of unopened flyers in my lap. "Oh. You know. Quiet week." There was a pause. "Listen," he said carefully, "Vanessa and I are thinking about hosting Easter this year too. I just wanted to mention it early in case you had plans." I almost smiled at the absurdity of it. Plans. As though holidays had not revolved around my kitchen for over 2 decades. "That sounds lovely," I replied calmly. "I am sure Vanessa will make it beautiful." Another silence. Longer this time. "Mom," he began slowly, "if something is bothering you," but he never finished the sentence because someone interrupted him in the background. I heard Vanessa's voice faintly through the phone. Sharp. Quick. Familiar. "Daniel, the Henderson call starts in 5 minutes. His tone changed immediately. "I have to go. We will talk later, okay?" "Of course," I said softly. The line disconnected before I could say goodbye. I sat there staring at my reflection in the dark television screen for a long moment afterward. Then I stood up and walked slowly toward the hallway closet, where I kept old photo albums stacked neatly on the top shelf. Dust rose lightly into the air as I carried them back to the dining room table. The first album contained photographs from Daniel's childhood. School plays. Camping trips. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the carpet while Richard pretended to assemble impossible toys without instructions. There was one photograph from Daniel's 10th birthday that stopped me completely. He sat beside me at our old kitchen table grinning proudly over a lopsided chocolate cake we had baked together from scratch. His little hand rested on my arm possessively, like he could not imagine a world where we would not belong to each other. I touched the photograph lightly with my fingertips. Then I opened a newer album. One Vanessa had actually put together herself several years ago after their wedding. The difference was immediate. Family barbecue. No Margaret. Ski trip. No Margaret. Thanksgiving dinner. Only Vanessa's relatives smiling around the table while Daniel sat near the edge looking oddly disconnected. Even the photographs that included me felt staged somehow. I appeared blurred in the background, carrying dishes or refilling drinks while everyone else faced the camera directly. I kept turning pages slowly as a cold understanding settled deeper into my chest. Vanessa had not removed me from the family suddenly. She had rewritten the family story until I no longer occupied an important role in it. And the frightening part was how politely she had done it. No shouting. No cruelty anyone could easily point to. Just constant small revisions. Tiny edits to reality. By the time evening arrived, snow had begun sticking to the sidewalks outside. I made myself tomato soup and half of a grilled cheese sandwich, then carried dinner into the living room. Around 7 o'clock my granddaughter Emma called unexpectedly through video chat using Daniel's tablet. Her little face appeared sideways at first before she adjusted the camera properly. "Grandma," she whispered dramatically, "Mommy says I have to practice piano again." I laughed softly despite myself. Emma had just turned 8 and still wore her blonde hair in messy braids that never survived a full day. "Your mother probably wants you to become famous someday," I teased. Emma rolled her eyes exactly like Daniel used to at that age. Then her expression changed suddenly. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart." She lowered her voice further. "Mommy said old people make dinner depressing." The room went completely still around me. Emma continued innocently before I could respond. "That is why she likes having friends over instead. She says younger energy feels lighter." I stared at my granddaughter's small serious face, while something inside me finally stopped making excuses. After my call with Emma ended, I sat motionless in Richard's recliner while the television flickered silently across the dark room. Snow continued falling outside in soft white sheets, covering the street little by little until the entire neighborhood looked muted and distant. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once before everything went quiet again. I wrapped my hands around my tea mug even though the tea had already gone cold. Old people make dinner depressing. The words should have hurt more than they did. Instead, they clarified something. Children repeat what they hear often. Emma had not invented that sentence herself. I could picture Vanessa saying it easily while loading the dishwasher or scrolling through her phone with one hand. Casual. Thoughtless. Like discussing the weather. The next morning I woke with a strange sense of calm I had not felt in weeks. Not happiness. Not anger either. Just clarity. I opened the curtains in my bedroom and watched pale winter sunlight spill across the snow-covered rooftops outside. Then I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of me. Richard used to make lists whenever life became complicated. "You cannot solve what you refuse to look at directly," he always said. So I started writing. Every cancelled invitation. Every holiday shortened. Every family photograph where I somehow disappeared behind the camera, instead of standing in front of it. The list grew longer than I expected. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "Hosting dinner again Sunday. Casual this time. No greeting. No warmth. No mention of Emma calling me." I stared at the message for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last summer at Emma's dance recital, Vanessa had insisted there were not enough tickets for everyone. I stayed home watching old movies alone while Daniel posted smiling photographs online afterward. 2 months before that, Vanessa told me their family ski trip had been planned last minute even though Emma later mentioned practicing skiing for weeks beforehand. Christmas brunch. 4th of July barbecue. Neighborhood block party. Every absence suddenly rearranged itself into a pattern too deliberate to ignore anymore. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. I opened the front door to find my neighbor Helen standing there bundled in a heavy green coat, with a foil-covered casserole dish balanced carefully in her gloved hands. "I made too much lasagna again," she announced cheerfully. Helen was 73, widowed even longer than me, and somehow permanently smelled like lavender and fresh bread. We sat together at my kitchen table while snow drifted lazily outside the window. Helen talked about her grandson applying to colleges, while I nodded politely and poured coffee into mismatched mugs. At one point she studied me carefully over the rim of her cup. "You look tired, Margaret." I forced a small smile. "Just winter, I suppose." Helen did not look convinced. "I saw that photograph Vanessa posted the other night," she said gently. My stomach tightened slightly. "Oh? You should have been in it." The simplicity of the statement nearly undid me. I looked down quickly at the steam rising from my coffee. Helen reached across the table and touched my wrist lightly. Richard would not have liked any of this. Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud in that quiet kitchen filled something painful inside me. Richard had always noticed things other people missed. Small changes in tone. Forced smiles. The way silence sometimes revealed more than words ever could. Suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier, shortly after Daniel married Vanessa. We had been cleaning dishes after Thanksgiving dinner, while everyone else watched football in the living room. Richard dried a plate slowly and said, almost absent-mindedly, "Vanessa likes control more than connection." At the time I thought he was being overly cautious. Richard had simply shrugged afterward. "Just pay attention," he told me quietly. I had not paid attention nearly enough. After Helen left, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the small home office Richard once used before retirement. I rarely entered anymore because everything still felt untouched in there. His leather chair. His old accounting books. The framed photograph of Daniel graduating law school. Dust floated softly through the afternoon light as I stepped inside. Then my eyes landed on the bottom filing cabinet drawer. For some reason I suddenly remembered Richard organizing paperwork there constantly during the last year of his life. Tax records. Insurance documents. Property deeds. "If anything ever happens to me," he once told me while labeling folders carefully, "promise me you will never let anyone make you feel small in your own family." At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. Now, standing alone in that quiet office with snow tapping softly against the windows, I realized my husband may have understood far more than I ever did. That evening I pulled the bottom drawer open slowly, half expecting nothing important to be inside. Richard had always been organized in a way that made ordinary paperwork look almost ceremonial. Every folder neatly labeled in his careful handwriting. Insurance. Taxes. Property records. Retirement accounts. I knelt beside the cabinet while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the office carpet in long pale rectangles. For a while I simply sorted through old documents quietly, breathing in the faint scent of leather and paper that still lingered in the room. Then I found the folder marked Lake Property. My hands paused immediately. The lake cabin had belonged to Richard's family for almost 50 years. A small cedar house on Lake Evergreen about 2 hours north of Columbus. Daniel learned to fish there when he was 6 years old. Every summer we spent weekends sitting on the old dock eating sandwiches while dragonflies skimmed across the water. After Richard died, I only visited twice because the place felt too full of memories. Still, I never imagined giving it up completely. I opened the folder carefully. Property taxes. Maintenance receipts. Insurance renewals. Then a legal document clipped neatly beneath everything else. The trust papers. I adjusted my reading glasses and began reading slowly. By the third page, my heart had started beating harder against my ribs. The cabin did not belong to Daniel. It had never transferred to him after Richard's death the way I assumed. The property remained entirely under a family trust controlled by me. My name appeared clearly beside every authorization line. Sole acting trustee. I sat back against the filing cabinet in stunned silence. For months Vanessa had spoken about renovations to the lake house as though ownership was already settled. New flooring. expanding the kitchen, hosting summer parties there. I remembered her casually discussing Airbnb rental income during Thanksgiving last year while Daniel nodded distractedly beside her. But legally, none of it could happen without my approval. I stared at Richard's signature at the bottom of the page. Dated just 8 months before he died. Suddenly another memory surfaced. Richard sitting at this same desk one winter evening while snow fell outside. Some people slowly confuse kindness with permission, he had said quietly while reviewing paperwork. At the time I barely looked up from the crossword puzzle in my lap. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. He hesitated too long before answering. "Just promise me you will pay attention after I am gone." I finally understood what he meant. Sunday dinner arrived 2 days later. I almost cancelled that morning. The sky hung low and gray outside my kitchen windows while freezing rain tapped steadily against the glass. But something inside me refused to retreat anymore. I dressed carefully in a charcoal wool sweater Richard once bought me in Vermont years ago and drove across town through slick winter streets lined with bare trees. When Vanessa opened the front door, surprise flickered across her face before disappearing behind her polished smile. "Margaret," she said smoothly. "You made it." This time there was a place set at the table. A real chair too. Not because she suddenly respected me. No. Vanessa had simply learned enough social instinct to realize her treatment of me had become visible. Daniel greeted me quickly from the kitchen while carrying a bowl of salad. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes like bruised shadows. "Glad you could come, Mom," he said quietly. I noticed he still did not hold eye contact for long. Dinner moved forward with the same carefully controlled atmosphere as before. Soft music. Expensive candles. Vanessa leading every conversation with effortless charm, while Daniel drifted silently beside her like a tired man following directions. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa brought up the lake cabin herself. "I found the most amazing designer from Cincinnati," she said brightly while sipping wine. "You would not believe what she could do with the cabin kitchen." Daniel nodded automatically. "The place definitely needs updating." Vanessa smiled. "We are thinking about opening up the main living area completely. Modern lake houses photograph so much better now." I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate before speaking. "That sounds expensive." Vanessa laughed lightly. "Well, it is an investment property now, right?" Then she looked directly at me for the first time all evening. "Daniel mentioned eventually keeping it in the family long term." There it was again. That assumption. That quiet certainty everything already belonged to them. I reached for my water glass calmly while watching her over the rim. "Interesting," I said softly. "Because according to the trust paperwork Richard left behind, the cabin still belongs entirely to me." Silence spread across the table so quickly it almost felt physical. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Vanessa blinked once, very slowly. For the first time since Richard died, I watched uncertainty enter her expression. Vanessa recovered quickly. "I will give her that much." The shock only touched her face for a second before her expression smoothed itself back into polite composure. She lifted her wine glass carefully and gave a small laugh that sounded almost natural. "Well," she said lightly, "of course it technically belongs to you right now. I just meant eventually." Daniel looked back and forth between us like someone trapped inside a conversation he did not fully understand. "I thought Dad transferred everything years ago," he said slowly. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. Apparently he was more careful than either of us realized. Vanessa smiled again, but this time the warmth did not reach her eyes. Richard always was meticulous with paperwork. The rest of dinner moved awkwardly after that. Conversation stumbled instead of flowing. Vanessa tried steering topics toward harmless things like Emma's piano lessons and a charity fundraiser downtown, but something underneath the evening had shifted permanently. For the first time in years, I was no longer sitting at the edge of the room emotionally. Vanessa knew it too. I noticed small things after that. The way she watched me when she thought I was not looking. The slight pause before she spoke. The tension in Daniel's shoulders whenever the cabin came up again. Even Emma seemed to sense something changing because she stayed unusually quiet through dessert, glancing nervously between her parents while pushing whipped cream around her plate with a spoon. After dinner, Vanessa carried dishes into the kitchen with sharp, efficient movements. Daniel followed behind her automatically. Their voices drifted faintly through the doorway while I remained alone at the table with Emma. The chandelier above us cast soft golden light across the polished wood surface. Emma leaned closer toward me carefully. "Grandma," she whispered. "Are you okay?" I smiled gently and brushed a loose braid away from her face. "I am just fine, sweetheart." She studied me seriously for a moment with those same thoughtful blue eyes Richard once had. "Mommy seems nervous." Before I could answer, Vanessa re-entered the dining room carrying coffee cups balanced perfectly on a tray. "Emma," she said pleasantly, "why do not you go finish your homework upstairs?" Emma slipped from her chair obediently and disappeared toward the staircase without another word. Vanessa set a coffee cup in front of me carefully. "Cream and 1 sugar," she said. I remembered. The statement would have sounded kind to anyone else. But I understood what it really was. A recalculation. I lifted the cup slightly. "Thank you." She sat down across from me while Daniel remained in the kitchen pretending to reorganize dishes that did not need reorganizing. Vanessa crossed one leg elegantly over the other and studied me with a smile too controlled to be genuine. "Richard never mentioned the trust structure to us," she said casually. "I suppose he wanted to keep things simple." I stirred my coffee slowly. Richard believed some things should stay protected. Her eyes narrowed almost invisibly. "Protected from what?" "From assumptions," I answered softly. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the next room, while snow tapped lightly against the dining room windows. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her arms loosely. "You know, Margaret," she said in a careful voice, "sometimes families struggle because older generations have trouble letting go." There it was again. Not direct cruelty. Never direct. Just enough to leave fingerprints on your dignity without anyone else noticing. I met her gaze calmly over the rim of my coffee cup. "And sometimes," I replied gently, "younger generations become so focused on replacing people that they forget relationships are not renovations." For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa did not have an immediate response. Daniel finally walked back into the room then, carrying a dish towel in one hand. "Everything okay?" he asked too quickly. Vanessa smiled at him instantly. "Of course." But I noticed something important in that moment. Daniel looked uncertain. Not manipulated exactly. Not innocent either. Just tired. Deeply tired. Like a man who had spent years convincing himself discomfort was the same thing as peace. Around 9 o'clock I stood to leave. Vanessa walked me toward the front door this time, instead of Daniel. Her heels clicked softly across the hardwood floors while warm light glowed behind us through the house. She handed me my coat herself. "Drive carefully," she said smoothly. Then, just before I opened the door, she added quietly, "I hope you understand we are only trying to build a future for our family." I paused with one hand on the doorknob. The cold night air drifted faintly through the frame. Slowly, I turned back toward her. "That is the problem, Vanessa," I said softly. "I used to think I was part of that future too." For the first time, her expression cracked completely. 3 days later, I met with Richard's attorney downtown. The law office sat on the 7th floor of an older brick building overlooking the riverfront, quiet and warm inside despite the freezing wind outside. I had not spoken to Harold Bennett since Richard's funeral nearly 6 years earlier. Time had silvered more of his hair, but otherwise he looked exactly the same. Conservative navy suit. Thin wire glasses. Calm eyes that missed very little. "Margaret," he said gently as I stepped into his office. "It is good to see you again." I smiled politely and removed my gloves slowly. "I wish it were under different circumstances." Harold nodded once, like a man who already understood more than I had explained over the phone. His office smelled faintly like coffee and old leather-bound books. Snow drifted softly outside the tall windows behind his desk while he motioned for me to sit. For a few moments we spoke quietly about ordinary things. Health. The weather. Retirement. Then I placed the trust paperwork carefully onto his desk. Harold adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents. "I found these in Richard's office," I said. "I realized recently there are things about our finances I never fully understood." He studied me for a long second before opening the folder. As he reviewed the papers, his expression remained calm but thoughtful. Finally he folded his hands together. "Richard asked me to prepare these very carefully before he passed." My chest tightened slightly. "Why?" Harold hesitated. "Because he worried." The room felt suddenly smaller somehow. "About Vanessa?" I asked quietly. Harold chose his next words with obvious caution. "Richard never disliked her. But he believed she viewed family relationships transactionally." Transactionally. The word landed heavily because it described exactly what I had been struggling to name for months. Harold continued gently. "Richard noticed patterns long before you did. Isolation. Control over social dynamics. Gradual influence over financial conversations." I stared down at my hands resting in my lap. "Why did he never tell me directly?" Harold's expression softened. "Because he knew you loved your son too much to hear it while Richard was alive. He hoped he was wrong." Silence settled between us while snow brushed quietly against the windows. Harold opened another folder from his desk drawer and slid it toward me. "There is something else you should probably know." Inside were additional trust documents I had never seen before. Investment accounts. Property holdings. Rental income from a small commercial building Richard purchased years earlier. My eyes widened slowly as I read through the totals. "Richard structured everything under your authority," Harold explained carefully. "The lake cabin. The investment portfolio. Even partial ownership of Daniel's current home down payment." I looked up sharply. "What?" Harold nodded once. "Richard provided most of the funds for that house through the family trust. Legally speaking, those assets still flow through you." For a moment I could not speak at all. All these years Vanessa had behaved as though I contributed nothing to their lives. As though I were simply an aging guest lingering too long near their future. Meanwhile the foundation beneath much of that future still carried my name. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. "Margaret, I am not telling you this to create division. But Richard specifically instructed me to step in if you ever appeared isolated or pressured." The word isolated echoed painfully in my chest. I thought about the folding chair. The missing photographs. The careful exclusions disguised as scheduling conflicts and misunderstandings. Did he think this would happen? I whispered. Harold looked toward the snowy windows for a moment before answering. "I think Richard understood that kindness sometimes attracts people who mistake gentleness for weakness." Tears burned briefly behind my eyes, but I blinked them away before they could fall. Richard had known. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not exactly how things would unfold. But he knew enough to protect me quietly long after he was gone. Harold slid another document toward me carefully. "There is also the matter of succession planning. If you ever decide to restructure the trust, you have full authority to do so." I stared at the papers silently while something steady and unfamiliar settled inside me. Not revenge. Not anger. Control. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like someone waiting to be included in her own family. When I finally left the office nearly 2 hours later, the snow had stopped completely. Pale winter sunlight reflected across the sidewalks while people hurried through downtown wrapped in heavy coats and scarves. I stood outside the building for a long moment breathing in the cold air. Then my phone buzzed inside my purse. A text from Vanessa. Daniel mentioned you met with Harold Bennett today. Is everything all right? I looked at the message quietly while traffic moved past me in slow afternoon lines. Then, for the first time in a very long while, I smiled before putting the phone away without answering. The following Sunday, I invited Daniel and Vanessa to dinner at my townhouse. I had not hosted them in nearly 8 months. Vanessa sounded almost surprised when I called. That sounds lovely, she said carefully after a brief pause. Should we bring anything? I looked around my quiet kitchen while afternoon sunlight warmed the countertops softly. No, I answered. Just yourselves. All morning I cooked the way I used to when Daniel was younger. Pot roast slow-cooked with carrots and onions. Homemade biscuits. Apple pie cooling beside the window. The familiar routines steadied me. By 6 o'clock candles flickered gently across the dining room table, and soft jazz played from the little speaker near the bookshelf. I set for places carefully this time. Real chairs for everyone. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Daniel carrying a bottle of wine while Vanessa stood beside him in a fitted ivory coat with cautious eyes and a practiced smile. Emma rushed in first and wrapped her arms around my waist tightly. Grandma, your house smells amazing, she announced happily. I kissed the top of her head. Some things never change, sweetheart. Dinner began politely enough. Daniel complimented the food several times while Vanessa praised the table setting with almost exaggerated enthusiasm. Emma chatted about school and piano lessons while snow drifted softly outside the windows. For a while, everything looked almost normal again. But underneath the evening sat a quiet tension none of us acknowledged directly. Halfway through dinner, Daniel finally cleared his throat softly. Mom, he began carefully, Vanessa mentioned you met with Harold Bennett. There it was. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate before answering. I did. Vanessa reached for her wine glass with controlled elegance. We were just surprised, that is all. We did not realize there were still financial details unresolved after all these years. I studied her calmly across the candlelight. There are many things people stop noticing when they assume someone no longer matters. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Emma looked between us quietly before focusing on her mashed potatoes again. Vanessa smiled carefully. Margaret, nobody thinks you do not matter. I almost admired how smoothly she said it. Really? I asked softly. Because invisible people usually notice things others miss. Silence settled over the table. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the snow-covered street before disappearing again. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. Mom, if this is about dinner the other night, it is not about one dinner, I interrupted gently. It is about years of being edited out of my own family one polite moment at a time. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly. That is not fair. I looked at her steadily. No, Vanessa. What was not fair was teaching my granddaughter that older people make life depressing. Daniel's head turned sharply toward his wife. What? Vanessa blinked quickly. I never, then she stopped because Emma had already lowered her eyes guiltily toward her plate. The truth sat there between us quietly. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair like a man finally seeing something he had avoided for years. Vanessa's composure began slipping in small ways after that. Her smile looked strained. Her answers shorter. For once she no longer controlled the emotional temperature of the room. I reached calmly for my water glass before speaking again. Richard spent years protecting this family financially, I said softly. And I spent years protecting it emotionally. But somewhere along the way, I became someone you both learned to tolerate instead of love. Daniel looked genuinely pained now. Mom, I never wanted you to feel that way. Feeling invisible does not happen overnight, Daniel. My voice remained gentle because anger no longer interested me. It happens gradually. One missing chair at a time. The room grew very quiet after that. Even the soft music from the speaker seemed distant somehow. Finally Vanessa set her fork down carefully. What exactly are you saying? She asked. I met her eyes steadily. I am saying the trust will remain under my control permanently. The cabin will not be renovated or used for rental investments. And I will be reviewing every financial arrangement connected to the family properties moving forward. Vanessa went completely still. Daniel stared at me in stunned silence. I continued calmly. I spent too long believing love meant making myself smaller so other people could feel comfortable. Richard never intended for me to disappear from my own life. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Emma quietly slid her small hand into mine beneath the table. I looked down at her warm little fingers wrapped around my own, and felt something inside me soften again. Not weakness. Peace. Daniel finally lowered his eyes toward his untouched dinner plate. I am sorry, Mom, he whispered hoarsely. And for the first time in years, I believed he actually meant it. I glanced toward Vanessa then. Her expression had changed completely. Not anger. Not embarrassment either. Something closer to realization. Like she finally understood the woman she dismissed so easily had never been powerless at all. I leaned back gently in my chair while candlelight flickered across the dining room walls. It is amazing, I said quietly, how visible a person becomes once everyone realizes they were never truly invisible to begin with.